from that time on, I have been working on this project on robots on sale. That the project that's titled Robots on Sale. So this is a joint project with Daiji Kawaguchi and Yukiko Saito. So this is sort of a follow-up study of a previous paper on the effect of robotization on employment in Japan. But now we try to move on more, kind of micro data-based analysis and study what's, firm level adjustment of robot adoption and employment and so forth. So this is another thing I should note before I start is this is a very preliminary project. So I think this is only the second time that I made a presentation in front of a public space. So that means any comments welcome. I'd like to have an interaction with you guys. So if you have any questions, if at any time I'm not clear, please let me know. Good. So I'd like to start this talk by, attracting attention that the effect of robots on employment, this has been attracting a lot of people's interests. And, from among people of policymakers, people of journalists, and of course, a lot of academic people, academic papers are studying this topic. So this means that there's a growing literature on this. What is the effect of robot adoption on employment? Theoretically, there's an ambiguous effect in the sense of maybe there's a strong substitution effect, or sometimes people say displacement effect of robot adoption on employment. But at the same time, robots in general, or by the way, I'm talking about industrial robots in general, in the manufacturing process, increases the productivity of let's say a plant that adopts robots, and therefore it increases the scale of production and therefore employment. So at least this is two competing effects. We can think about more complex effects that can be added to this mechanism, but we already see that theoretically it's kind of ambiguous if the robots increases or decreases employment. And the recent empirical literature, on the other hand, is examining this effect of robot adoption at the firm level, because the firm level is one of the most kind of granular, kind of finest level in which we can examine the automation effect, or more particularly, the effect of industrial robots on employment. So specifically, it can provide a clear mechanism about the existence or within firm substitution of robots. Do the firm that adopt the robot reduce or increase the employment afterwards? Or perhaps we could find, as a result of empirical analysis, it can be that there's no effect of a within firm substitution, which is more about the story of a positive employment. Positive side of a story about automation, that the automation is making the economy or firm productive, and therefore employment increases. So that's pretty much the frontier of the literature. The kind of a limitation in this literature so far is that no paper, as far as I know, has examined the rigorous exogenous variation in the robot adoption, meaning that these papers look at the firm and compare the firms that adopt robots and the firms that didn't adopt robots. And they essentially compare the trend of employment or sales or productivity over time using a sort of an observational variation of adoption of robots. So it's essentially the control group and the treatment group can be or cannot be maybe selected into the adoption of robots. But these papers essentially did not use the exogenous variation in the robot adoption. So we'd like to, in this paper, fill this gap by using the policy variation. So specifically, we are going to use the investment promotion policy that happened in Japan in the last 10 years. And then we are going to examine the effect first of the policy implication of, let's say, the investment promotion. Did it promote the robot adoption? And if the firms are promoted to adopt robots, do they increase or decrease employment or other margins of adjustment, such as increase in the productivity and sales and other outcome variables? So in other words, we'd like to study the clean causal evidence of robot adoption on many outcome variables, including employment. All right, so specifically, this project is going to do the following things. First, we are going to leverage the policy variation in special depreciation in robot adoption. So I'm going to talk about the policy detail in a minute, but special depreciation in one word is actually allowing the firm to increase the depreciation rate of the cost so that they can reduce the corporate tax payment in this year and backload the payment of it in the later years. So as long as the firm is discounting forward, they want to reduce the payment of tax today, this year. So this has a strong implication, strong incentive to the firms that wants to adopt robots and that for discounting forward. And we argue that this policy has a variation across firms and years, and this variation is pretty much external to each firm, mainly because this policy change was unannounced and unexpected. So that we are going to use this variation to examine A, did the firms that are affected by this policy variation adopt robots? And B, if these firms adopt robots, what do these firms increase or what do these firms do about their workers and their sales? So to use this variation, we are going to use a new data set. So specifically, we conduct a survey on Japanese manufacturing firms. So a new part of this unique survey is that we are going to ask how many and how much monetary value of robots do each year buy in each year. And then we also do some kind of randomization technique to sort of kind of mitigate the concern about the selection into the survey, because it's typical that this types of survey is subject to the response group bias compared to the non-response group. So we wanted to test that there's a smaller concern on that bias. So we are going to combine these two features. We combine this policy variation and microdata of robot adoption, and then we study the event study estimation and policy-based impact of robot adoption. As a bottom line, we'd like to claim that both of these results, the event study regression, in which we study the effect of the adoption event of robots on the long-run implication on employment and sales, it increased compared to the firms that didn't adopt the robots. And at the same time, if we study the policy-based impacts of robot adoption, we confirm the evidence that we found from the event study, in the sense that when the firm adopt robots due to the incentive that are created by special depreciation in the policy, at the same time, these firms are in an increasing trend in terms of employment. So these results reveal that robot adopters, on average, relatively speaking, increased employment as well as sales. So this is sort of a story that is optimistic about the adoption of automation technologies and industrial robots. And mainly, this could be because of the increased scale effect, so that the firms can be more productive and getting more sales, and therefore these firms can employ more people. And this effect dominates the substitution effect. All right, so before moving into the contents, I'd like to just briefly compare what we have done to the existing literature. So as you can see in this slide, there's actually increasing number of papers that are examining this effect. So we selected the papers that uses the firm level observation, firm level data on robot adoption, and study the effect of robot adoption on employment and other outcome variables. Even if I feel that this very stringent or like this very tight selection criteria, I can find these many number of people, many number of papers, and most of them are only within the 5 years. So this literature is expanding very rapidly. What we actually want to add to this literature is, again, we want to use the policy-induced variation. Okay, so we are going to study the special depreciation policy that actually changed within our sample period. And we want to use this firm level and year level variation that are exogenous to the firm to study the effect on robot adoption and the effect of the robot adoption on employment, which is a causal effect, which we call as a causal effect. Another thing I should mention is that this is the first firm level analysis in the Japanese context. So in Japan, there has been a paper, there has been data existed, but that's only at the industry level or application level of a robot. And therefore, we are adding some kind of a new data set to this context in which the robot adoption history has been very, very long. And we also study the intensive margin of robot adoption because we can examine how many robots each firm buy and how much monetary value of robot each firm buy according to the policy variation, as well as we can study the 1% increase in the value of robots impact on outcome variables at the firm level. So this is what we have done compared to the past literature. If you don't have any questions, I'd like to talk about the background of this policy. And then I want to move on to the data we collected. And combining these two, we'd like to talk about empirical analysis. All right. So what we are going to talk about in this paper is something that's called a TCPPEI. So that's a kind of long abbreviation. We need to still find a better way of abbreviating this one. But this is a direct translation of Japanese policy name to the English. So TCPPEI stands for tax credit for promoting productivity enhancing equipment investment. So this, as the name tells, this policy encourages adopting advanced equipment in general. And so advanced equipment is not only limited to industrial robots, but for the purpose of being clear about definition, we'd like to focus on industrial robots for this paper. Okay, and also this gives us a kind of a comparability to the existing literature because it seems that this literature has been evolving around the use of industrial robots instead of other general advanced equipment, advanced technologies, which is of course interesting to examine, but for today's purpose, let's focus on the effect of industrial robots. Now, under TCPPEI, it's important that almost all the firms in Japan are eligible for tax benefits when they adopt, advanced robots. So there's a kind of a requirement for the robots to be new compared to the old. But in our data, we check that almost all the robots are pretty much a newest model because obviously that's giving firms a lot of financial incentive to adopt these new robots. So pretty much almost all the firms, I think we can say that many firms, almost all the firms are affected by TCPPEI. Okay. So this tax credit can be decomposed into two elements. The first one that we focus on is a special depreciation, which I abbreviate as the SD, right? And there's another benefit of the tax credit. And for today's purpose, let me focus on special depreciation. Again, it reduces the present discounted value of the corporate tax burden when the firm purchases a capital goods, which is in the list of the advanced equipment that are listed in the policy TCPPEI. Okay, I'm going to talk about how this special depreciation actually operates in terms of a firm's incentive in the next slide. But before that, let me just give you a kind of a overview of the timeline. Okay, TCPPEI is a policy that applies to the robots purchased between January of 2014 and March of 2017. And there has been a lot of political reason why this policy started in this period and why it ends in March in 2017, which means that we are going to use both the variation of the start of the policy, the start of the TCPPEI introduction, as well as the end of the TCPPEI. Okay. So what happens except for this period, before this January 2014, there's actually also a different tax benefit for the firms, but that's much more selective in the sense of the number, size of the firm. So only the firms that are smaller in terms of the number of employees, less than 1,000 workers, were able to apply for the tax credit or special depreciation for the adoption of new technologies. And this is completely due to completely different motivation than the TCP/PI, which is essentially trying to promote the adoption of new technology, advanced equipment for the small and medium-sized enterprise, because there's a lot of political interest in promoting the investment among the small and medium-sized enterprises, which means that for the SME companies, there is throughout the whole sample period of ours, I'm going to talk about sample period in a few slides, the tax benefit has been there, but it is only between January 2014 and March 2017 when the large firms, bigger than 1,000 workers, are eligible for applying for TCP/PI. Okay. Another variation is the rate of the special depreciation. So this policy special depreciation rates also vary across time. So we are going to also use this kind of intensive margin, the policy rate variation over time and across firm size. So let me talk about a little bit of detail of the mechanism of special depreciation. As I said in the introduction, the special depreciation is a mechanism that backloads the corporate tax payment. So I'm just giving you some numerical example to give you the idea of what it does. Okay, so this is pretty much a sort of corporate finance 101 class. So if you are familiar with it, it's very simple thing. But just in case for you, just in case you are not familiar with this kind of policy or tax credit system. So suppose that the company wants to invest 100,000 US dollar sales firm, invest 100,000 US dollar worth of robots. Okay, so if you do that, suppose that your profit is go away if you because you pay a lot of money for purchasing of robots. But robots are essentially investment goods, so that you in normal times, without any law such as a TCP/PI, you are not allowed to depreciate all the cost of purchasing robots within a year, right? Because that's going to reduce the corporate tax payment, and that's problematic for the tax authority. So the case one is the case without special depreciation, meaning the normal depreciation schedule should apply. And suppose that the normal depreciation schedule is a straight line method for 5 years. So this means that you split the 100,000 US dollar investment over 5 years evenly, and you must depreciate that cost over 5 years, as written in the case one. Okay. So in this case, because your sales is let's say 100,000 US dollars, and then if you depreciate cost of a robot purchase in year one, then your profit schedule over 5 years is going to be, let's say, 80,000 US dollars. And if the corporate tax rate, whatever it is, let's suppose just for numerical example, 10%, then your corporate tax is going to be 8,000 US dollars in each year. Okay, so that's the kind of normal circumstances. But suppose that there's a policy introduction of the special depreciation. Then suppose that special depreciation rate becomes 100%. Then you are allowed to depreciate all the costs in the first year. Okay, then you don't have to depreciate at all in the future years, which gives you the following stream of the profit. In the first year, your profit becomes zero because you subtract all the cost subtract all the sales amount by the special depreciation this year. But later, your special depreciation, you depreciated all the cost of purchasing of robots, and therefore your profit remains higher in the later years, which gives you this stream of the corporate tax payment. In the first year, you don't have to pay any tax at all, but then later you have to pay slightly higher amount of tax. So obviously, this is just a backloading. So if you just sum across all the payments over time, it doesn't change any corporate tax payment in total. In the 5 year, you pay 40,000 US dollars for corporate tax in both case 1 and 2. But as long as you are forward discounting firm, right, you want to backload the payment of anything you don't want to pay, right? So so if you are a firm, you prefer case 2, and under case 2, you have a stronger incentive to adopt robots because essentially it reduces the present discounted value of the payment of corporate tax compared to case 1. Okay, so the bottom line, the special depreciation is by reducing the present discounted value of the tax payment, introduces an incentive for the firm to adopt robots. Okay, and how does the policy change look like? So we can plot the policy variation over time during our sample period. So I'm going to talk about sample period later, but I just plot between 2010 and 2021. And as I said, the TCPPEI was introduced in 2014, and it terminated in 2017. Okay, so during this period, the bigger firm enjoys a lot of special depreciation, right? As I said, except for this period, large firms, which are denoted in the blue dashed line, is not having any kind of a policy promotion in terms of adoption of advanced technologies. So it's hitting 0 for except the period of TCPPEI. But during this, it jumped up to 100% for the first several years. And there's some policy rate change within the TCPPEI period too. At the same time, smaller sized firm has a little bit more incentive for the adoption of robots, that they are incentivized by the other policy than TCPPEI for the adoption of robots. But it also has some variation over time by the introduction of TCPPEI. Okay. Importantly, these policy changes were pretty much unexpected to many firms. There are 2 reasons behind this. First, this policy is based on an act called the Industrial Competitiveness Enhancement Act that was established in December of 2013. So there's only 2 months period for before the adoption of TCPPEI in which this law went into effect, right? The law went into effect in December 2013, and the TCPPEI introduced in January of 2014. And secondly, even in this act, ICEA, it didn't specify the exact policy details, right? It just mentioned that we are going to introduce some incentive method for promoting adoption of robots, but it didn't say anything about is that a 100% special depreciation rate, or is that for the bigger firm or smaller firm. So there's no way in which the firms can know the policy detail before the adoption of this policy. This means that this policy effect was pretty much unexpected, and therefore we are going to use this variation across time and across firm size for identifying the effect of policy on robot adoption as well as employment. All right, so that's pretty much the detail about the policy change that I want to employ in this study. If you have any questions. But otherwise, I'd like to move on to the description of data. All right, so to study this policy change, we'd like to conduct a survey. We'd like to conduct a firm-level survey on robot adoption, which we call as the Survey of Industrial Robot Ownership. Sometimes we use abbreviation SIRO. Okay, and this survey was run in January and February of this year, 2022. As I said, the threshold for this policy, sorry for going back, the threshold this policy was around 1,000 workers, which is essentially pretty much a large side of the firms. So this survey, because we wanted to use this policy variation, this survey targets the large manufacturing firms to study the policy threshold. And we collaborated with a company, the credit agency company called the Tokyo Shoko Research, TSR. So they are entrusted to implement the survey. And the good part of doing this is that this is a credit agency company. So it essentially has an old list of the companies that exist in Japan, that are listed in Japan. And it has all the firm level information so that we can collect the employment, we can collect sales, we can collect the input-output relationship for each firm that are included in the survey. Okay. So that's how we get the outcome variables. And so in this survey, this questionnaire asked the quantity and the value of robots during 2010 and 2021 retrospectively. So we sent out a survey questionnaire to each firm, and each firm is asked to answer how many robots did you adopt in 2021, in 2020, 2019, and etc. Up to 2010. Okay. And importantly, all the required information to answer this survey is recorded in fixed asset registry. And this is important because you don't have to actually go to each plant in your firm to see what kind of robots are operating there. And this is important because it's very costly for a firm to do that. If we ask such information, we would expect that the response rate of that survey is reduced significantly. So we wanted to contain all the information that we ask in the survey to be minimal as possible so that the response rate could be enhanced. Okay, so this survey is primarily sent to an accounting department in the firm, and that accounting department is enough to answer all the questions in the questionnaire. That's how we kind of devise the questionnaire as much as possible. I guess I can see some person raising your hand, so thanks for.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, so I just wanted to clarify. So you collect the record of all robots from 2010 inclusive until 2021, including those years. That?
Exactly. Yes. So I'm including 12 years.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Good. So, and the reason why we wanted to do is related to the low response rate. So it's very well known that if you initiate your own kind of survey, the response rate is not that great. So in our case, we tried all our best to increase the response rate, but it's still like 13%. So, still we can't say we are kind of collecting the representative sample among our sample population of the survey. And therefore, you might wonder if there's a kind of selection issue due to non-response. Okay. To address this concern, we conducted this randomizing method for addressing the selection, detecting the selection, existence of the selection. So the idea is the following: we do a follow-up calls for a selected number of the firms, and we randomize the group of firms that receives follow-up calls and that didn't. Okay. What we can do is by comparing the firms that by comparing the firms that are urged, that are followed up, and they answer the questionnaire, and compare the answer of the questionnaire, contents of the questionnaire, with the firms that didn't receive the follow-up calls, then we can kind of detect if at the margin of the firms, if there are selection regarding the answer to the survey. So what we have checked is summarizing the following. We could regress the number of the reply to this questionnaire, excuse me, on the randomized follow-up group, and the follow-up times the dates after call. So we have a specific date of a call. I think it was 14th of February. And what we can see is there is a significant increase in the number of the replies after this survey. But at the same time, we don't see systematic differences in terms of a response. So for example, if we regress the number of the quantity of robots on this difference in difference variable, then we don't find a significant difference in the quantity of robot adopted. And at the same time, the similar results hold for the log prices. So this is the evidence that we are not so much worried about the selection issue. So that, we are going to take this overall response rate of 13%, and the results that are obtained from these 13% firms as a sort of as good as a randomized, as good as a population result. Okay, so the next thing is about the descriptive statistics. So we collected number of observations close to 2,700 observations. And most of the robots acquired in 2016. And what's kind of interesting is that, for example, if you look at the quantity number, of course, most of the firms, when they adopt robots, that the average and median number of the robot adoption is only 1. But if you look at the 90th percentile, so these firms adopt robots on average 2 robots. So that it's not only always that firm adopt robots by 1 unit, but sometimes they adopt more than 2 units. Okay, there's some yeah, so that's pretty much for the survey descriptive statistics. And moving on to the firm level outcome variables in 2010. So we can take employment, sales, and other firm level information from the TSR data, as I mentioned. And this TSR data reveals that survey targets are larger and older on average. Okay. So, well, that's the design of the survey. So we are not surprised by that. What's kind of interesting is that we can compare the TSR firm level outcome between the group of firms that answer the questionnaire of the robot SIRO and not. Okay, when we do that, we are confident that our sample is pretty much not so much selected in the ways that affects the outcome variables here. So if you compare the log employment for the group of selected for the group of selected firms, answered firms and non-answered firms, we don't see a large statistically significant difference in the log employment, and similar for the other outcome variables. Okay, so that's a yeah. So that's the summary statistics for the outcome variables. And moving on to the robot adoption in our data.
Sorry.
Yes.
Daisuke, so I think we have a question again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. I just wanted to specify your sample selection. So basically, you sampled any companies or companies that adopted like a minimum number of robots, or
oh no. So yeah, good point. Thanks for clarifying. So although I have shown that giving you the impression that all firms adopted robots, this is the sample that are taken from the SIRO data. So in SIRO, you answer the number of robots. So if you adopt 0 robots, you don't answer anything. And that's why I have one robot. There are firms that answered with completely blank answers to the questionnaire, which means you don't adopt the robots at all during my sample period. And those firms are recorded in my in the total form. So the answer is that we include both the robot adopters and non-adopters. Very good. So thanks for clarification. Moving on to the robot adoption trend, so this is the kind of a sample correspondence to the one that I have shown you before about the policy variation. So when we compute the shares of our policy target firms, naturally during the period of TCPPEI, more than 1,000 worker firms in the target group of the policy with a very high probability, right, with a very high share. But for smaller firms, the share of being in target group of the policy is pretty much high, constantly over sample period. So again, we are going to use this kind of across firm size and across year variation for identifying the robot effect. Okay, so on the right-hand side, what we show is a kind of aggregate statistics of the share of the robot adopters in each year. Okay, so we kind of separate a group of firms into small, relatively small, and very, very large firms. And what we find is that overall, the robot adoption trend is increasing. That's kind of not surprising. Robots are, kind of in an increasing trend in everywhere in the world. That's not exceptional in Japan. But at the same time, what we find is an accelerated adoption in the for the large group of firms in the red solid line in the period when the TCPPEI was enacted. Okay, so we see this as a kind of partial evidence that the TCPPEI increased the adoption of robots, and that's the robot adoption trend. And we can see the industry disaggregation of these increase in the robot adoption. So the left panel shows the smaller firm, and the right panel shows the larger firm. And this is a trend of the industry distribution of robot adopters. So sorry for a little bit small letters, but I just highlight some findings. But for the small firms, it is predominantly the transportation equipment sector that adopted robots, both historically and also in the recently. But if you look at the more recent period, it is increasing in the food industry that are adopting robots because there is a significant technological growth in the food industry. Robots that are used in the food industry, such as food picking and packaging. And these tasks are increasingly done with some productivity at scale by industrial robots. And pretty much similar pattern for the larger firms. But for the larger firms, perhaps due to the economies of scale, there are kind of much more broader set of the industry that are adopting robots. So it's not only the transportation equipment, but also other industries are evenly adopting robots if you are large enough and if you are productive enough. Okay, so that's a kind of a data pattern. Let me move on to the empirical analysis and my empirical findings. So the first thing we have done is that, by exploring the literature standard, meaning we compare the dynamic treatment effect of robot adoption versus non-adopters. Specifically, we defined the event variable DIT is equal to 1 if firm I adopt robots in year T. Okay, and we are interested in the effect of the initial robot adoption in a sample in a data. So we define the initial adoption event EI for each firm as the first year that the firm adopt robots. And we examine the outcome variable, for example, log employment, for example, log sales, on the dynamic treatment effect of the initial adoption event. So we are interested in this coefficient beta EK, right? E stands for event study. And this measures the relative effect of robot adoption in K years after the event, because we are regressing on the indicator variable that year is K year after the initial adoption event. Okay. We follow a recent method for allowing heterogeneous treatment across cohorts. Here, the cohorts means that in which year did you adopt the robots? And we expect that maybe during this transition period of robot adoption, the effect could be heterogeneous across cohorts. So we adopted the method that accommodates that possibility. Okay, so this is the event study results. What we found is that in the left panel, we show the effect on the log employment. On the right panel, we show the effect on the log sales. And I'm plotting the coefficient of -5 years of robot adoption and 5 years of relative years of robot adoption. What we find is we don't find any significant pre-trend before the adoption of robots. This is kind of consistent with the idea that the robot adoption was not so much predicted beforehand. But after the adoption of robots, we see an increase in the employment relative to non-adopters, with the coefficient of, roughly speaking, 0.04 or 0.03. For the medium run, meaning that this positive effect lasts for the 1 year or 2 years after the adoption of robots, but this ceases to be significant in the end. So there seems to be somehow a medium run or short run positive effect of employment by adopting robots. And we can see the similar results for the log sales, but with a little bit magnified coefficient. Okay. Yes, so this is essentially just comparing a sort of observational variation of robot adoption to the outcome variable. So we want to study the policy effect in next. So for this purpose, we define the policy variable CIT, which varies between 0% and 100% as a special depreciation rate under policy regime. Okay. So it varies again with the firm characteristics such as the firm size and the years due to reasons external to each firm. So we want to use this variation to move the robot adoption as well as the outcome variables. Specifically, as I mentioned in the policy discussion slide, if the ZIT variable is large, then we expect that the firm is likely to adopt more robots because they have a stronger financial incentive to reduce the corporate tax payment in the present value sense. Okay, specifically, because we have this variable for each period, we want to study the dynamic response to policy rate changes. So we use the local projection method that are developed recently, that are developed at first in the macro literature, but recently adopted in the applied micro literature by Dube et al.'s paper. So the idea is that when the policy changes, right, a ZIT value varies, right, what's going to happen to the change in the outcome variable before the t minus 1 year, so last year, up to t plus k years, okay? So this idea is that we want to compute the impulse response of the change in the policy on the outcome variable for each k period, okay? We also include LIT minus 1000, which is essentially controlling for the size of the firm. And this can be thought of as a running variable of the firm size in the regression discontinuity design. So we want to obviously control for the running variable, but we want to see the effect that are across the firm size threshold between 1000 workers. And in this specification, because we wanted to control for a differential trend for the firms that are for the firms in years before the adoption of robots, before the introduction of TCPPEI. So we want to separate the individual fixed effect before and after the adoption of TCPPEI, and we wanted to estimate this fixed effect separately between these periods. And again, what we are interested in, the coefficient of interest is beta pk, that measures the relative effect of a policy on the long-run effect on the outcome variables. We also do some IV regression. For the IV regression, we need to have the same number of instrumental variable as the outcome as the endogenous variable, but we only have one instrumental variable. So the approach we took is simply doing the fixed effect IV model to study the effect of policy-induced robot adoption, meaning we regress simply the outcome variable on the robot adoption, where the robot adoption RIT is instrumented with the policy special depreciation rate, CIT. And we can, of course, include, because we have a firm level panel data, we can control for the firm fixed effect, that controls for the firm level unobserved heterogeneity that are constant across time, and we can also control for the aggregate implication, aggregate effect, economy-wise effect that are constant across firms. Okay, so this beta IV shows the relative causal effect of robot adoption on outcome variables YIT. Yes, so. I think I want to speed up a little bit. This slide is essentially talking about what kind of policy variable should I use. So each column is showing you the results of the robot adoption implication of policy rate, where the policy rates are computed with the different method across columns. And what I wanted to conclude is that the choice of the policy variables are not so much important qualitatively to the robot adoption. No matter what policy variable I use, the policy special depreciation rate positively significantly affect the robot adoption. And but for the later result, I focus on the column 1, in which I choose I choose column 3, in which the policy variables are defined according to the smaller and medium-sized enterprise, with the definition that depends on the profit, as well as we use the policy margin of intensive margin instead of extensive margin. Okay, so that's fairly a detail of the of our research design. We want to move on to the next result, in which we study the policy response of robot adoption. So we are regressing on different outcome variables on the special depreciation rate. The first column shows us the binary variable, the result with the binary variable of robot adoption, right? So this result says that when the special depreciation rate moves between 0% and 100%, the probability that the firm, relatively speaking, adopts robots increases by 2.5%. Okay, so that there's a strong, implication to the increased probability of robot adoption. But not only that, we can see that the log robot quantity increases by the similar amount, 2.4%. And perhaps a little bit interesting thing for us is that when a firm, there's a different implication to the log robot value, right? In the sense that when the special depreciation rate is increased, the total value of robot adoption increases by 5%. This means what? This means that the total value increases more than the total quantity, meaning that the firms that are induced to buy robots thanks to the special depreciation seems to be buying a little bit more expensive robots and perhaps a high quality robots. So the margin of adjustment is not only about the quantity of robots, but it's also affecting the value, the unit value of robots purchased. Okay, so the effect of a dynamic policy analysis is as follows. We can compare the effect of a change in the policy special depreciation rate on the employment in the long run, right? And what we find is that it seems that the policy-induced firms increase employment in the long run, and there's no pre-trend again. So this is again confirming the effect that the policy-induced, the firms that are induced to buy robots increase employment, and we can find the similar results for the log sales. And the coefficient, again, is close to 0.2 or 0.3, and therefore, the firms that are induced to buy robots due to the special depreciation rate increase from 0% to 100%, increases 0.2% to 3% increase in the employment in the medium run, such as in the 4 years or 5 years. Okay. So that's a part of our main result. When we move on to the policy IV regression, we find a kind of similar pattern. So this panel A is showing you the effect of robot the IV regression when we take the endogenous variable of robot monetary value. Okay. And each column is showing you the different specification. So the column 1 is showing you the first stage in which we confirm that there's a strong positive implication of special depreciation rate on the robot adoption. And in the reduced form, we find that employment increases when the firm is induced to buy robots thanks to special depreciation. And similar for the log sales in column 4. Combining column 1 and column 2, we find that the two-stage least square results of 0.101 effect, 0.101 increase in the employment of due to the adoption of robots that are incentivized by the adoption of special depreciation, and 0.271 for the log sales. And panel B is changing the endogenous variable from the log robot value to robot adoption extensive margin. And because at the extensive margin, we tend to have a stronger effect. So it seems that we are having a very large employment effect in a positive way and a very large sales effect in a positive way. So again, these results, the IV regression results, confirm there's a positive employment and sales impact of robot adoption for the robot adopters compared to the non-robot adopters, even when we use the exogenous variation of robot adoption. Okay. All right. So I'd like to stop here. I think I've talked quite good. So let me wrap up. So what we have done in this paper is that we wanted to estimate the causal effect of robot adoption on firm outcomes. So for this purpose, we use the variation that are brought by policy changes in special depreciation that happened in Japan during between 2014 and 2017. To study this case, we implement a survey of robot adoption. So this survey is pretty much tailored to study this policy change. We aimed at larger firms and we studied between 2010 and 2017 so that we can observe the firms' behavior during the policy and during not during the policy. So that was good for us to conduct kind of a difference in difference type of analysis. As a result, what we find is perhaps surprisingly, the robot adoption did increase employment relative to the firms that didn't adopt robots. So this finding is robust to the use of policy variation. So no matter if we just did the event study or the policy analysis, we found a positive implication of robot adoption on employment. Therefore, as a result, our finding means the following policy implication. It casts out on the excessive fear towards automation. As long as firms are accepting the robots in a productivity and enhancing way, it's not directly reducing the employment, but what we found in our context is that there's a robust increase in the employment as well as sales. All right, so that's not the end of the story. I think we'd like to continue moving on to study the other outcome variables, such as propagation across supply chains, because as I said, we collected the data from the credit agency, so we can observe the upstream firm or downstream firm of the robot adopters and how does that propagate throughout the value chain. That might be having some important implication to the macroeconomic implication, instead of just assuming all the firms are isolated. And also we are thinking about merging more government data to study the product level or occupation level implication. So far, we have only studied the aggregate employment at the firm level or aggregate sales, but we can study more, kind of a different dimension in the outcome variables. But that's more to come later. Thanks so much. I'd like to stop here.